You're coming with me. Mail order bride rescues dying rich cowboy at the station. Clara Whitmore had never imagined that her life would bring her to a small, dusty train station at the edge of the western frontier. At 26 years old, she felt much older than her age. Life had not been gentle with her. After her parents passed away within 2 winters of each other, she was left alone in a crowded eastern city where no one had time to care about anyone else's struggles. The factory where she worked was loud, cold in winter and hot in summer. The pay barely covered rent for her tiny room and simple meals of bread and soup. Each day felt the same, and each night she wondered how long she could keep living like that. It was on one of those quiet evenings when rain tapped against her small window that she noticed the advertisement in the newspaper. It was simple and direct. A ranch owner in the Western Territory was seeking a wife. He offered security, a home, and partnership. The ad explained that he was a hard-working man with land and cattle but no family. He was not looking for beauty or wealth. He was looking for companionship and someone willing to build a life beside him. Clara read the words again and again. At first she thought it sounded foolish. Marry a stranger? Travel across the country to meet a man she had never seen? It felt like something from a story, not real life. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she had little to lose. She had no close relatives left. No one depended on her. No one would stop her from leaving. The city had given her survival, but nothing more. She wrote back to the rancher, whose name was Daniel Hayes. She kept her letter honest. She told him she was not fancy, not highly educated, and not wealthy. She told him she could cook simple meals, sew clothing, and manage a household. She told him she valued loyalty and hard work. Weeks later, she received a reply. Daniel's letter was short but respectful. His handwriting was steady. He explained that he owned one of the largest ranches in the territory. His days were long and filled with responsibility. He had built everything from the ground up after losing his own parents when he was young. He did not promise romance. He promised fairness, protection, and partnership. He ended his letter with a simple line, "I believe 2 honest people can build something strong together." They exchanged a few more letters over the next 2 months. None were filled with sweet poetry. Instead, they spoke about daily life. Clara described the noisy streets of the city. Daniel described wide-open land, golden fields, and skies that stretched forever. Slowly, a quiet trust began to grow between them. It was not love yet, but it was hope. When winter began to loosen its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, Clara made her decision. She sold the few extra belongings she had, packed her clothing into one small leather bag, and purchased a one-way train ticket west. The morning of her departure was cold but clear. As the train station filled with steam and noise, Clara stood still for a moment, watching families hug and children laugh. No one stood beside her. She felt a brief wave of fear. What if this was a mistake? What if Daniel was not the man he claimed to be? What if she arrived and found regret waiting for her? But then she reminded herself that staying behind would mean a lifetime of what if? She lifted her chin, stepped onto the train, and found her seat by the window. 3 long days of changing landscapes and restless thoughts. At first, the view outside showed crowded towns and factories. Smoke rose into gray skies. Then slowly, buildings became smaller and farther apart. The land opened up. Fields replaced streets. Rivers shimmered under sunlight. Clara watched it all quietly, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Across from her sat an elderly woman who noticed her nervous expression. "Traveling far?" the woman asked kindly. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied. "To the Western Territory. Family there?" Clara hesitated. "A husband?" she said softly, though the word still felt unfamiliar. The woman smiled gently. "Then you are braver than most." Clara wasn't sure she felt brave. She felt uncertain, hopeful, and afraid, all at once. At night, as the train rocked back and forth, she lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of the wheels on the tracks. She imagined what Daniel might look like. In her mind, he was tall and strong, with sun-browned skin from working outdoors. She imagined firm handshakes and quiet confidence. She wondered if he would be kind. She wondered if he would approve of her plain dresses and simple manners. On the second day, the train stopped briefly at a small town. Clara stepped outside to stretch her legs. The air felt different, cleaner, wider somehow. There was a scent of earth and wind instead of smoke. For the first time in years, she took a deep breath that did not feel heavy. By the 3rd day, the passengers had grown quieter. The land outside had become mostly open plains, dotted with distant ranch houses and grazing cattle. The sky seemed enormous, stretching without limit. Clara pressed her fingers lightly against the cool glass of the window. Somewhere beyond that horizon was her future. As the train began to slow near its final stop, her heart pounded. She carefully smoothed her dress and adjusted her hat. She checked her reflection in the small mirror inside her bag. She did not look like a grand bride. She looked like a hard-working woman ready for a new beginning. The train let out a long whistle as it rolled into the small frontier station. The platform was made of wooden planks, worn from years of boot stepping across them. A few townspeople stood nearby, waiting for deliveries or letters. Horses were tied to a wooden rail. Dust moved gently across the ground in the afternoon breeze. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she stepped down from the train. She searched the faces in the crowd, expecting to see a strong man standing tall and steady. Instead, she noticed something strange. A group of people had gathered near the far end of the platform. Their expressions were serious. A murmur of worried voices filled the air. Curiosity and concern pulled her closer. As she approached, the crowd shifted just enough for her to see a man lying on the wooden boards. His hat had fallen beside him. His face was pale, and his breathing looked shallow. His once strong frame now seemed fragile and still. Clara felt her stomach tighten. She recognized him immediately from the photograph he had sent in his last letter. The same sharp jaw, the same thick, dark hair. But the confident posture from the photograph was gone. "Marianne," someone nearby whispered. "That's Daniel Hayes." The world seemed to pause. This was not the strong cowboy she had imagined, waiting to welcome her. This was a man fighting for breath. Dust swirled around them as the train behind her released another cloud of steam, but Clara barely heard it. Her journey of 3 days, her months of letters, her brave decision, all of it had led to this moment. She had arrived expecting to begin a marriage. Instead, she had arrived at the edge of a crisis. For a brief second, fear tried to take control. She did not know these people. She did not know this town. She had no friends here. She could have stepped back. She could have told herself this was not her responsibility yet, but something inside her refused to turn away. Clara Whitmore had crossed the country for a chance at a new life. And as she stood there on that dusty platform, staring at the man she had agreed to marry lying helpless before her, she understood one thing clearly. For a few long seconds, Clara could not hear anything except the sound of her own heartbeat. The crowd around Daniel Hayes spoke in low, worried voices, but their words blended together like distant noise. Dust moved across the wooden platform, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over his still body. Someone bent down beside him and shook his shoulder lightly. "Daniel, can you hear me?" There was no clear response, only a faint movement of his chest. Another man removed his hat and wiped his forehead. "He just stepped off his horse and collapsed," he said. "Hasn't been looking well these past weeks." Clara stepped closer, her small leather bag still hanging from her arm. She studied Daniel's face carefully. His skin looked too pale for a man who spent his life under the sun. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his lips looked dry. She knelt beside him without asking permission. The men around her looked surprised. They did not recognize her. "Miss, you should stand back," one of them said gently. "This is serious." Clara did not move. She carefully placed her fingers against Daniel's wrist, searching for a pulse the way she had once done for her mother years ago. It was there, but weak and uneven. "He's burning with fever," she said quietly. A few of the townspeople exchanged looks. "The doctor's been sent for," someone replied. "But he's out on another call. Might take time." Clara knew how important time could be. She glanced around at the unfamiliar faces. No one seemed ready to take charge. They respected Daniel as a wealthy ranch owner, but in this moment, they seemed uncertain. Clara swallowed her fear. She had crossed the country alone. She could not stand still now. "Help me sit him up," she said firmly. The men hesitated. "And you are?" one asked. Clara lifted her chin. The words came out stronger than she expected. "I am the woman who came to marry him." "You're the mail-order bride," someone whispered. She kept her eyes on Daniel. "He needs shade and water. He cannot stay here on the hot boards." The station master scratched his beard, still unsure. "We can't just move him without knowing." "We can't leave him here either," Clara interrupted gently but firmly. "Please." There was something steady in her voice. It was not loud, not dramatic, but certain. Slowly, 2 men bent down to assist her. Together, they carefully lifted Daniel into a sitting position. His head fell forward slightly, and Clara quickly supported him with her arm. "Daniel," she said softly near his ear, unsure if he could hear, "you're not alone. His eyelids fluttered faintly, but he did not fully wake.
A young boy ran up with a small bucket of water.
Clara dipped her handkerchief into it and pressed the cool cloth against Daniel's forehead. The heat of his skin worried her. He's been pushing himself too hard, one ranch hand admitted. Refused to rest. Said there was too much work to do. Clara felt a quiet frustration. Pride could be dangerous. She had seen it before. People ignoring their own limits until their bodies forced them to stop. A wagon stood nearby, tied to a post. Clara turned toward it. Whose wagon is that? Belongs to the feed store, a man replied. Can we use it? She asked. The store owner nodded quickly. Of course. Without wasting another second, Clara spoke clearly. We need to take him home. Does he have staff at the ranch? Yes, a ranch hand answered. Housekeeper, cook, stable workers. Good, Clara said. Then we must get him there now. As the men carefully lifted Daniel into the back of the wagon, some of the townspeople continued to stare at Clara with curiosity. She knew what they were thinking. She had arrived only moments ago, and already she was giving instructions. But she could not worry about opinions. She climbed into the wagon and sat beside Daniel, holding him steady as the driver snapped the reins. The wheels rolled forward, leaving the station behind. The road to the ranch stretched across open land. The wind picked up slightly, lifting strands of Clara's hair from beneath her hat. She kept one hand on Daniel's shoulder and the other steadying his head so it would not jolt with every bump. Stay with us, she whispered quietly. As they traveled, one of the ranch hands riding alongside spoke up. Miss, Clara, is it? You sure you're ready for this? Ranch life isn't easy. I did not travel 3 days to turn back at the first problem. The man nodded slowly, impressed. They reached the ranch house after what felt like forever but was likely less than an hour. It stood large and strong against the wide land, built from solid wood with a deep porch wrapping around the front. It was clear Daniel had built something important here. When the wagon stopped, several workers rushed forward in shock. What happened? The housekeeper cried. No time, Clara said as she climbed down. Prepare his bedroom. Fresh sheets, cool water, and send someone again for the doctor. The housekeeper blinked. And you are? Clara met her gaze steadily. I am Clara Whitmore. I came to marry Mr. Hayes. The older woman's eyes widened, but she quickly nodded. Then we best move quickly. Large windows allowed sunlight to pour into wide hallways, but there were few personal touches. It felt like a place built for function, not warmth. They carried Daniel upstairs and laid him gently onto his bed. Clara immediately removed his boots and loosened his collar to help him breathe more easily. She asked for clean cloths and began cooling his forehead again. The housekeeper returned with a worried expression. Doctor is still not back in town. Clara inhaled slowly. Then we do what we can until he arrives. Perhaps a handshake? Perhaps awkward conversation on the porch? She had imagined nervous smiles and careful introductions. Instead, she stood beside his bed, sleeves rolled slightly, focusing on keeping him alive. The room was quiet except for the sound of his uneven breathing. Clara noticed how tired his face looked even in rest. She wondered how long he had been hiding his weakness. How long had he carried this alone? She dipped the cloth into cool water again and gently pressed it to his skin. You're coming with me, she murmured softly, repeating the words forming clearly in her heart. You don't get to leave yet. One of the ranch hands watched from the doorway. Most folks would be frightened, he admitted quietly. Clara did not look up. I am frightened, she answered honestly. But fear does not mean we stop. The sun began to lower outside the window, painting the sky with soft gold and orange colors. Time felt strange, moving quickly and slowly all at once. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound of a horse arriving echoed outside. The doctor had come. He examined Daniel carefully, his expression serious. Clara stood close, listening to every word. Possibly an infection that's been building for weeks. Will he recover? Clara asked quietly. The doctor hesitated. If his body is strong enough. But he will need constant care. Day and night. Clara did not hesitate. Then he will have it. The doctor looked at her more closely. You must be the bride he mentioned in his letters. He spoke of you. The doctor said gently. Said you sounded steady. Then he must live to tell me that himself. As night fell over the ranch, lamps were lit throughout the house. Workers moved more quietly than usual. News had already begun to spread through town that Daniel Hayes had collapsed at the station on the very day his bride arrived. In his bedroom, Clara pulled a chair close to the bed. She knew she could not predict what the coming hours would bring, but she also knew one thing clearly. She had stepped off that train not just to become someone's wife, but to build a life. And life, she was learning already, did not begin with comfort. It began with courage. She folded her hands in her lap and prepared herself for a long night. No matter what anyone thought, she had made a promise the moment she knelt beside him on that wooden platform, and she intended to keep it. The first night at the ranch felt longer than the 3-day train journey Clara had just completed. The large bedroom was quiet except for the soft crackling of the oil lamp and the uneven sound of Daniel's breathing. Outside, the wind moved across the open land, brushing gently against the windows. Everything felt still, as if the whole ranch was waiting. Clara sat beside the bed, with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had not even unpacked her small leather bag. It rested near the door, forgotten. Her new life had begun not with introductions or smiles, but with responsibility. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. Severe fever, exhaustion, possible infection, constant care. She looked at Daniel's face. Even in his weak state, she could see signs of the strong man from the photograph he had sent her months ago. His hands were large and rough from work. His shoulders were broad, though now they looked heavy against the pillows. He seemed like someone who had carried more than just ranch duties on his back. The housekeeper, Mrs. Harper, entered quietly with a small tray. "I brought fresh water and clean cloths," she whispered. "You should rest, miss. It's been a long day." "I will rest later." "You don't even know him yet." Clara gave a faint smile. "That may be true. But I know what it means to be alone while sick. No one should face that." Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, her expression softening. "If you need anything, call for me." After she left, the room grew silent again. Clara dipped a cloth into the bowl of cool water and gently pressed it against Daniel's forehead. His skin was still too warm. She counted his breaths quietly, watching for any change. Hours passed. The lamp burned lower. Clara forced herself to stay alert. Whenever Daniel stirred slightly, she leaned closer. At some point past midnight, his breathing grew more uneven. Clara stood quickly and checked his pulse again. It felt weak but steady. She whispered softly, unsure if he could hear. "You are stronger than this," she said. "Your ranch needs you. Your people need you. And I came all this way to meet you." She felt strange saying those words. They were true, yet still new to her heart. Near dawn, Daniel began to murmur faintly. His words were unclear, but his brow tightened as if he were troubled by dreams. Clara placed her hand gently over his and spoke in a calm tone. "It's all right, you're home." Slowly, the tension in his face eased. When morning light began to filter through the curtains, Clara realized she had not closed her eyes even once. Her body felt tired, but her mind remained focused. She had done this before, long ago, when her mother had fallen ill. She remembered the fear, the long nights, the feeling of watching over someone you love and not knowing what tomorrow would bring. Mrs. Harper returned with warm broth. "The doctor said to try small amounts when he wakes," she reminded Clara. "If he wakes," Clara corrected gently, though she quickly regretted the choice of words. "He will," Mrs. Harper said firmly, surprising her. "Mr. Hayes is a strong man." Clara hoped that was true. The ranch that morning felt different. The usual sounds of laughter and loud conversation were gone. Workers moved quietly across the yard. News had spread fast. Everyone understood how much depended on Daniel. He was not only the owner, but also the leader. His strength had always made others feel secure. Now, uncertainty lingered in the air. By midday, the doctor returned to check on him. He listened carefully to Daniel's chest and examined his eyes. "The fever is still high," he said, "but not worse than last night." "That is a small blessing." Clara nodded, holding on to that small hope. "You must keep him hydrated," the doctor continued. "And if he wakes, encourage him to drink." After he left, Clara remained at her place beside the bed. She noticed how quiet the large house felt. Though it was grand in size, it lacked warmth. There were few personal decorations, no family portraits, no soft touches that made it feel like a home. She wondered how many evenings Daniel had spent alone in this room. Had he eaten dinner in silence? Had he worked himself late into the night because there was no one waiting to tell him to rest? As afternoon turned to evening, Daniel suddenly shifted more strongly than before. His eyelids fluttered. Clara leaned forward quickly. "Daniel?" she said softly. His eyes opened slightly, unfocused at first. He seemed confused, as if unsure where he was. His lips parted, but no clear words came out. Clara reached for the cup of water and carefully supported his head. "Slowly," she whispered. "Just A little. He managed a small sip before his eyes closed again, but this time his breathing seemed steadier. Clara felt a wave of relief, so strong that she had to steady herself against the chair. It was the first real sign of progress. Late that night, as the sky outside filled with stars, Daniel's eyes opened once more. This time they stayed open longer. He looked directly at Clara, though his gaze was weak and filled with confusion. "You're—" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Clara," she answered gently. "I arrived yesterday." A faint look of understanding crossed his face. "The station, you fainted," she said calmly. "But you are home now." "You stayed," he murmured. Clara gave a small, tired smile. "Of course." He seemed to drift again, but before his eyes closed fully, he whispered something that made her heart tighten. "I'm sorry." Clara did not fully understand what he meant. Sorry for collapsing, sorry for not being there to greet her properly, or sorry for bringing her into uncertainty. But she squeezed his hand lightly. "There is nothing to apologize for," she said. Over the next 2 days, the pattern continued. Daniel drifted in and out of awareness. Each time he woke, he seemed slightly stronger. Clara fed him small spoonfuls of broth. She kept the room clean and quiet. She encouraged him to rest without letting the silence become heavy. On the third morning, he managed to sit up with her support. The effort left him tired, but it was a clear sign of improvement. "You should not be doing all this," he said weakly. "And who else would?" He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "You just arrived. This is not how it was meant to begin." Clara looked at him steadily. Life rarely begins the way we expect. For the first time, there was something different in his eyes. Not just weakness, but gratitude. As the days passed, color slowly returned to his face. The fever lessened. His voice grew stronger. Workers began to smile again when they heard he was improving. One evening, as golden light filled the room, Daniel looked at Clara more clearly than ever before. "You could have walked away," he said. "No one would have blamed you." Clara thought about that for a moment. She remembered the train ride, the fear, the moment she saw him lying on the station platform. "I did not come here to run at the first sign of trouble," she replied softly. "I came to build something steady." Daniel leaned back against the pillow, studying her with quiet respect. He realized then that the woman sitting beside him was far stronger than he had imagined from her letters. In those difficult days, something important had formed between them. It was not built on grand promises or sweet words. It was built on action, patience, and shared struggle. And as Daniel slowly regained his strength, he understood one clear truth. The woman who had stepped off that train was not just a bride by arrangement. She was the reason he was still breathing. By the time the second week arrived, Daniel could walk slowly across his bedroom without support. The first time he stood on his own, Clara stayed close, ready to catch him if he lost balance. But he did not fall. He was weaker than before, yes, but he was steady. The ranch seemed to breathe again. Workers returned to their normal rhythm. Horses were trained in the open fields. Cattle were guided across wide land under the bright sky. The sound of boots on wooden floors and friendly voices in the yard slowly replaced the heavy silence that had filled the house. But even as Daniel's strength returned, something else began to surface. Quiet truths that had been buried under pride and responsibility. One afternoon, Daniel sat on the porch, wrapped in a light blanket, watching the land stretch endlessly before him. Clara brought him tea and placed it carefully on the small wooden table beside his chair. "You should still rest," she reminded him gently. He gave a faint smile. "You sound like the doctor. And you sound like a stubborn rancher," she replied calmly. For a moment, they both allowed themselves a small laugh. It was simple, but it felt important. After a few seconds of silence, Daniel's expression grew more serious. "I owe you honesty," he said quietly. Clara sat down across from him. "You owe me nothing, but I will listen." He looked out at the fields instead of directly at her. "I knew I was not well before you arrived." Clara did not interrupt. "I felt weak for weeks," he continued. "Dizzy, sometimes. Tired in a way that sleep did not fix. The doctor warned me to slow down, but I did not." "Why?" she asked softly. Daniel let out a slow breath. "'Cause this ranch does not run on hope alone. It runs on leadership. If the men saw me weak, they would worry. If my competitors heard rumors, they would take advantage. Land deals, cattle prices, everything here depends on strength." She was beginning to understand that his silence had not been only about pride. It had been about fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of appearing fragile in a world that respected only toughness. You carried it alone, she said quietly. Yes, he admitted. And it nearly cost me everything. There was no drama in his voice, only truth. Clara folded her hands in her lap. Strength does not disappear because you admit you are tired, she said gently. It grows when you allow others to stand beside you. In her eyes, he did not see judgment. He saw calm understanding. Over the next few days, Daniel began sharing more. He spoke about building the ranch from almost nothing after his parents passed away. He had been young, too young to carry such responsibility, but he had no choice. He worked day and night, learning through mistakes, pushing himself harder each year. Success came slowly, then steadily. Land expanded. Herds grew larger. His name became respected. But success also built walls around him. People treat wealth differently, he said one evening as they walked slowly along the edge of the property. Some show respect. Some show envy. Very few show honesty. And what do you show? Clara asked thoughtfully. Daniel paused at that question. I show control, he answered after a moment. Control keeps things stable. Clara nodded. Control can protect a ranch, but it cannot replace companionship. The wind moved gently across the tall grass around them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. It was peaceful, yet the conversation felt important. In town, however, not everyone was peaceful. Whispers had started almost immediately after Clara's arrival. Some said she was fortunate to arrive just in time to secure her future. Others questioned whether her sudden authority in the house meant she had larger plans. A few even suggested she had somehow exaggerated Daniel's condition to gain influence. Mrs. Harper mentioned the rumors one morning while folding laundry. Small towns talk, she said with a sigh, especially when something unexpected happens. Let them talk, she replied calmly. Truth does not need to shout. But Daniel felt differently when he heard about it. They question your intentions? He asked, his jaw tightening. Clara gave a small shrug. People often fear what they do not understand. You saved my life. I cared for you, she corrected gently. The rest was your strength. He shook his head. No. Many stood at that station. Only you stepped forward. That evening, Daniel made a decision. The following Sunday, when most of the town gathered near the general store and church hall, Daniel appeared publicly for the first time since his recovery. He walked slowly but confidently, with Clara beside him. The murmurs quieted as people noticed them. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke in a steady voice. I owe this woman my life, he said plainly. On the day she arrived, I collapsed. Many feared the worst. She did not. He glanced at Clara briefly before continuing. She did not come here for wealth. She came here for partnership, and she has already shown more loyalty than I have earned. The crowd remained silent, but their expressions shifted. Respect replaced doubt. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. She had not asked for recognition. She had only done what felt right. After that day, the whispers lessened. Back at the ranch, life began to take on a new rhythm. Clara did not attempt to change everything at once. Instead, she observed. She noticed small inefficiencies in the kitchen and quietly improved them. She spoke kindly with the ranch hands, learning their names and listening to their concerns. She suggested small adjustments to daily schedules to prevent exhaustion during the hottest hours. Daniel watched carefully. You see details I overlooked, he admitted one afternoon. I see people, Clara answered. Details follow naturally. It became clear that Clara brought something to the ranch that money could not buy. Balance. Where Daniel had driven himself and others with strict expectations, Clara introduced calm structure. Where he had focused on expansion, she focused on stability. They began discussing decisions together, land purchases, supply orders, worker schedules. For the first time in years, Daniel did not feel alone in leadership. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Daniel spoke quietly. When I placed that advertisement, I expected a practical arrangement, a household manager, a polite companion. And what did you receive? A partner, he said honestly. Silence filled the room, but it was not uncomfortable. It felt steady. Outside, the ranch stretched wide under the moonlight. It was still the same land, the same cattle, the same fences, but something fundamental had shifted. Daniel had always believed survival required standing alone. Clara had shown him that survival could become something stronger when shared. And as winter fully faded into spring, the ranch no longer felt like a place built on one man's strength. It felt like a home shaped by two steady hearts learning to trust each other, slowly, honestly, and without fear. Spring arrived fully, and with it came a feeling of new beginnings that neither Clara nor Daniel could ignore. The heavy days of illness were now behind them. The ranch fields were bright green again, dotted with grazing cattle and wildflowers that had pushed through the soil after the last frost. The air felt lighter, and so did the house. Daniel had regained most of his strength. He still tired more quickly than before, but he no longer tried to hide it. If he felt exhausted, he rested. If a task could be handled by someone else, he allowed it. That change alone surprised many of the ranch hands. They were used to seeing their employer work longer hours than anyone else. One morning, Clara found him standing by the fence watching the sunrise. The sky was painted in soft shades of gold and pink. She walked up beside him quietly. "You're up early," she said gently. "So are you," he replied with a small smile. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. The wind moved gently across the land, carrying the scent of fresh grass. "I used to think mornings were only for planning work," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Now I see they are also for gratitude." Clara glanced at him. Gratitude for what? For being given another chance? Those words carried weight. Clara knew he was not speaking lightly. The memory of that day at the station still lived clearly in both their minds. It had become the quiet turning point of their lives. As the days passed, the house slowly transformed. Clara added small touches that made the large rooms feel warm. Simple curtains, fresh flowers on the dining table, neatly arranged books on shelves. She did not change the structure of the home, but she filled it with care. The ranch workers began to notice the difference too. Meals felt more welcoming. Conversations at the end of long workdays were filled with laughter instead of tension. Even Mrs. Harper, who had managed the house for years, admitted, "One afternoon, it finally feels lived in." She earned it naturally. She asked questions instead of giving orders. She listened more than she spoke. When problems arose, like a broken fence after a storm or a disagreement between workers, she encouraged calm solutions. Daniel watched her closely, often amazed at how naturally she connected with people. He had built his success on discipline and strength. She built hers on understanding. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Daniel turned to her with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "That sounds dangerous." He laughed softly. "I mean it. When I first wrote that advertisement, I thought marriage would solve my loneliness. I thought bringing someone here would simply fill an empty chair at the table." Clara listened without interrupting. "But what I did not understand," he continued, "was that loneliness is not cured by presence alone. It is cured by connection." "And have you found connection?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "In ways I did not expect." There was no grand speech, no dramatic moment, just honesty shared under an open sky. Not long after, they decided to hold a small wedding ceremony. They had already agreed in letters to marry, but neither wanted the event to feel rushed or forced by illness. They wanted it to mark a true beginning. The ceremony was simple. It took place under a large oak tree near the edge of the property. The ranch hand stood proudly nearby. Mrs. Cobox's Harper wiped her eyes more than once. A few townspeople attended, including the doctor, who smiled as if he had witnessed a miracle. Clara wore a modest white dress she had sewn herself during quiet evenings. Daniel stood tall beside her, steady and confident, though this time his strength felt different, calmer, wiser. When asked to speak, Daniel surprised everyone. "I was a man who believed he needed no one," he said clearly. "I believed success meant standing alone and never showing weakness. The day I collapsed at the station, I learned how wrong I was." He turned toward Clara. She arrived expecting to begin a life with me. Instead, she found me at my lowest point. She could have turned away. No one would have blamed her. But she stepped forward and said, "You're coming with me." And she meant into a future. "She did not save only my life," Daniel continued. "She changed how I live it." When it was Clara's turn to speak, she kept her words simple. "I did not come here looking for wealth," she said softly. "I came looking for a chance to build something steady and honest. I did not expect it to begin with difficulty, but sometimes the strongest foundations are built during storms." The vows were spoken. The promises were made. There were smiles, handshakes, and warm congratulations. But the true celebration came later, in the quiet moments when they returned to the house together. It no longer felt like Daniel's ranch alone. It felt like their home. Months passed, and the ranch flourished more than ever before. Not only because of good weather or strong cattle prices, but because leadership had changed. Daniel no longer carried every burden alone. Clara stood beside him in decisions both large and small. They created schedules that allowed workers time to rest. They invested in better equipment to ease heavy labor. They even opened part of their land for community gatherings during harvest season, turning business into connection. Slowly, the story of the station day became local legend. Newcomers to town would hear it from older residents. "That's the ranch where the mail-order bride saved Mr. Hayes," someone would say. "She stepped off the train and took control," another would add. But those who truly knew the story understood something deeper. It was not about dramatic rescue. It was about choice. Clara had chosen courage over fear. Daniel had chosen humility over pride. Together, those choices built something stronger than either of them had imagined. One evening, nearly a year after her arrival, Clara stood once again at the small train station. This time she was not alone, and she was not uncertain. Daniel stood beside her, healthy and steady. They had come to welcome new supplies, but Clara found herself looking at the exact spot where she had first seen him lying on the wooden platform. "Strange, isn't it?" Daniel said softly, noticing her gaze. "How one moment can change everything." Clara nodded. "If you had not collapsed, we might have met differently." "Yes," he agreed, "but I believe we would have reached the same place eventually." She smiled at that thought. The train whistle blew in the distance, just as it had on the day she arrived. But this time, there was no fear in her heart, only quiet gratitude. Life had not begun the way she expected. It had begun with urgency, uncertainty, and long nights. But it had grown into trust, partnership, and steady love. And as they turned to walk back toward the ranch together, side by side, one truth remained clear. Sometimes it starts with someone strong enough to say, "You're coming with me," and patient enough to mean it every single day afterward.